I'm ready to get started. If you are, if you need more time, let me know.
I am good to go. Lovely to meet you again.
Lovely to meet you again as well. So, please tell us a bit about who you are and your latest book, Becoming Baba Yaga.
Becoming Baba Yaga is my fifth book, but let me back up a little bit because it all folds into the greater story.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kris Spisak. I am an author and someone passionate about the transformational power of language and storytelling. Everything I have ever written or likely ever will fall under that umbrella. My first three books, which started with Get a Grip on Your Grammar, and then followed by the novel editing workbook and the family story writing workbook, those were all stories and books that were designed to help empower your language, whatever you may be writing, whether you are working on the next great American novel, your family history that you wish someone had written down, or your business communications, or any other usage of your words that you might be doing. My fourth book was my first debut into the fiction world, where I took a story of a Ukrainian grandmother who survived World War II, and all she wanted to do before she died was get back onto Ukrainian soil. And that is a novel. It goes from there, including a step with her stepping off an airplane in Eastern Europe, present day, and disappearing. And in that novel, there are Baba Yaga stories throughout. For those of you who are not familiar with the Slavic goddess or Slavic folktale character, Baba Yaga, she is a masterful mystery. And I know we're going to dive into her, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of introduction on my first four books here, because it was my fourth book, which is fiction, that really plays a lot with Baba Yaga as a character in folk tales and bedtime stories and whispered codes of bravery between family members of a certain heritage. That was what inspired me to write my latest, which is called Becoming Baba Yaga, Trickster, Feminist, and Witch of the Woods. It's my new nonfiction coming out September 2024 in audio and paperback. And I know we're going to dive into that conversation.
Well, let's start with who Baba Yaga is and what she represents to you.
It's such a complicated and beautiful question, because Baba Yaga is somebody who in modern American pop culture keeps popping up. She pops up in John Wick. She pops up
That's
in,
right, I
goodness,
forgot, yeah.
DreamWorks Puss in Boots. So she's all over the place. And sometimes she gets this description. I think it's in John Wick, where Keanu Reeves' character has the code name of Baba Yaga. And the subtitles come in and it says, Baba Yaga, Boogeyman. And I think anybody who knows anything about Baba Yaga shudders just a little bit, because Baba Yaga is so much more than this evil villain. She is so much more than a Disney witch that you might think of as a character like that. She is a character or a goddess of transformation in her roots, that she has 2,000 years plus of history that you can find in archaeological digs, in oral traditions,
Mm, mm,
of this character who might eat you for supper if
right.
she does not find you worthy, but she also might make your wildest dreams come true if you pass her tests. It's a matter of, are you respectful? Are you good hearted? Are you brave? Um, and are you a hard worker? And if you pass her tests, she can be transformative in the history of oral storytelling. And if not, she's going to eat you. Um, I stumbled upon her years ago, and I think the more time I spend with her, she just continues to fascinate me.
So the Baba Yaga that I know is kind of the Grimm's fairy tales version of the
Right.
woman who will eat children and lives in a hut with dancing chicken feet. But
Oh,
I
yeah.
did not know that there's a 2,000-year-old historical record. So let's go back to the be so does that suggest that this is, well, my first question is, which group of people originates this figure and what was this concept at the very beginning? Was this meant to be a historical figure? Was it just a folklore of a group of people at the beginning? What was the genesis of this?
The origin as far back as I can go. It's a old Slavic goddess. And depending on the tradition, you can take it as far back as 7,000 years, but it starts getting a little bit
Wow.
fuzzy at that point in
Okay.
history.
Okay.
There was a culture that was making pottery that was more advanced than what the ancient Egyptians were doing. They had city centers that actually had cities of up to 9,000 people. The culture was called the Kuchitenic Tropea culture. It's a culture that had a burn, kind of slash and burn culture. When they left one location, they burned everything to the ground. Hence, no monuments, no structures, no statues, nothing lingered. So they completely disappeared in the historical record for many, many years. And a lot of ancient world historians are starting to rediscover them now, and they're fascinating. And they were in Slavic lands. We're talking Ukraine, we're talking Poland, Slovakia, that area of the world around the Black Sea.
Okay.
And in that area, you had all of these ancient cultures. And as we're digging down and discovering more about this one group of people, we're discovering all of these figurines and statues of women. And these were not just statues that seem to be artistic artifacts. They seem to be objects of worship. And it's consistently women, and it's consistently looking at paintings that are this swirl figure on their wombs. And the more we're diving into it, there is a divine feminine at play.
Is this the same as when they were finding stone figurines all over the world with large
Yes,
hips?
the stone babas.
This is the same thing. So, and this was all over the world, right?
Yes. Yes, this was a related thing. This was more specifically in kind of Slavic lands.
Okay, but it was
The
similar.
stone babas are of the same tradition.
Okay. Okay. So it was like the Slavic variation of that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Fascinating.
exactly.
Okay.
So zoom forward a couple thousand years, and we have a goddess that we actually have a little bit more of a history about. Her name was Madazira Zemlya, and she was a goddess of the earth, kind of the Proto-Slavic earth deity. And she is someone who you would go to whisper your darkest secrets to by digging a hole in the earth and whispering your secrets into the earth. It was considered profanity to spit on the earth because that was like spitting on your mother. And so you have this woman who listens to your secrets, no matter whether you are good, no matter whether you are making terrible choices. She is a listener, and she is someone who will help judge and help decide your fate. So that is just fascinating to me, that you have this figure who is helping figuring out what is right, what is wrong, how do I judge, how do I empower? And so we have records of her. And in this future folklore version of Baba Yaga that arises out of many different influences, every little Slavic goddess along the way that we have in the historical record, they're pieces of all of those goddesses and who she is. So, for example, Madasira Zemlya, she was often represented as like being the earth or a hole in the earth, and this idea of whispering in holes. And the Baba Yaga story, you have Baba Yaga, who is constantly diving into the holes of the earth to escape. Or sometimes she's even seen as this blind figure. When you look her in the face, it's like looking these two holes. She doesn't have eyes. She just has these two deep holes that go into her skull. And you just have all of these segments of other goddesses in her. You can fast forward. There was another goddess called Mokesh, who there was a prince in Kiev who put a statue up to her in 980. It was Prince Vladimir, who was grandson of Prince Olga of Kiev. If you've ever heard of her, she's a fascinating and dark historical figure full of fabulous stories.
What fascinating and dark? Why? Who's this person?
So Princess Olga of Kiev, there are a lot of great stories about her. So as the story goes, Princess Olga of Kiev, her husband was killed by a neighboring community. And instead of being like waging war or something after her husband, who was the leader, waged war after he died, instead of waging war or something, she said, you know what, all I want as a kind of in a memory of my husband is I want to have one pigeon from the sill of every single house in your village. And that's all I will take. And I want you to do this in memory of my husband. Now, this is a story. Is it true in the historical record? Likely not, but it's a great story. So the villagers all collect the pigeons from all of the different buildings of their village. They bring them across to Princess Olga where she lives. And as the story goes, Princess Olga then ties sulfur to the legs of every single pigeon, releases every single pigeon, and then the pigeons all flock home to the buildings where they live upon all of these thatched roofs. And what happens with all of this sulfur flapping against all of these thatched roofs? And as the story goes, the entire village who killed her husband then is engulfed in
Wow.
flames and has disappeared. I
Wow.
mean, what a story, right?
That's pretty out there. So I've never heard Baba Yaga referred to as a goddess, more as a folk,
Oh,
like a monster or a folklore
yes.
figure. So that's really interesting. And to say that, I mean, 7,000 years, this is all news to me, that this is a Slavic goddess that I'm guessing got maybe appropriated and denigrated during the in by folklore or by somebody's take on folklore. So how did she go from being a goddess to this kind of horror movie figure?
Right. And that's actually what Princess Olga, her grandson, Prince Vladimir, in that moment in year 980, so 980, he was still venerating this goddess Mokesh. Again, another divine female spirit. She was of the Kiev pantheon of goddesses, if you're familiar at all with that piece of history and that area of the world. So he put up a statue to this goddess Mokesh in 980. 8 years later, he converted to Christianity and he tore down this goddess statue. And all of a sudden, all of these divine female statues, which again, the divine female in this part of the world goes back like 7,000 years. This is why we call it Mother Russia sometimes.
Hmm.
There's this idea of the divine feminine that is just between the lines
Hmm.
of so many pieces of Slavic culture. But in this moment, Christianity starts to enter into the world. In this moment, you have all of these people where the old faiths and the new faiths combine. This is where the devil starts becoming a major figure, because remember, the devil was not really a major figure in the Bible
Hmm.
originally.
Right,
The
right.
devil, yes, exactly, is he became a big storyline to convert people to Christianity.
You want to hear a funny joke, by the way?
Oh, please.
You know why the devil that I'm gonna need to verify this, but you know why the devil is seen as a goat figure?
Oh,
Because
why?
in England at the time, goats were seen as the most horrible animal because they ate everyone's crops. So the churches I depicted the devil as a goat because that's what everyone hated and was afraid of. So it's just kind of like old English stuff.
Oh,
Anyway,
I love
side
that
note.
stuff.
Yeah.
I love side notes. Like, this is my favorite thing. And that's kind of where this new book and where all of my latest Baba Yaga research, it's just full of rabbit holes and side notes. And did you know this fascinating piece of history? And yes, as we're all familiar with the story, the moment Christianity and old belief systems merged, suddenly Baba Yaga, who was perhaps derived from goddesses who were the people who helped transport people into life. So the midwife figure, if you will, someone who would take a soul into being born, but then on the other side of things, take that soul and be a partner in death, going from the mortal realm to the other realm. That goddess figure suddenly became partnered with the Christian devil figure. And she was now a figure of death,
Hmm.
and the story changed. And that's the fascinating thing about her, because as you trace her record, her story changes and twists and morphs and cajoles, and kind of the secrets of her bloodlines just hiding between the lines.
Hmm. Super interesting. So in assessing the Baba Yaga, so as a modern person looking at Baba Yaga as an archetype or as a symbol, what was it about her? What does she represent, or what can she represent to modern people today? And what was it about her in a modern context that seized your imagination so strongly?
It was the idea that she's a figure of transformation, not a figure of evil. And some witches, as you know, and when I say the word witches, I mean in the classic story tale version of the word witch,
Hmm.
would fly up around on a broom. Baba Yaga does not fly around a broom. Baba Yaga has a pestle and a mortar. So imagine your ancient apothecary tool or your ancient grinding of herbs or what I have in my own kitchen for making my guacamole.
Okay.
Your mortar and your pestle. This was her vessel for sailing around the world. She would have a giant stone or sometimes iron bowl that she would ride around with. And then the pestle that you would use for grinding in your mortar, she would use this like a paddle and paddle through the skies. In some versions of the stories, there is also a broom who flies magically behind her to sweep away any tracks that she may be making. But it's this idea of transformation that caught my eye. And I relate this with the mortar because that's what she flies in. What is a mortar? It's something that transforms herbs from the forest into medicine. It's something that transforms ingredients into recipes and food and sustenance to
Okay.
nourish us. That piece of transformation hides between so many aspects of who
Interesting.
she is.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a bit like I suppose it's very alchemical. It's like Shiva transmuting poisons.
Yeah,
I like that. That's interesting. I imagine that appealed to you that, obviously story is all about transformation. So I imagine that appealed to you from
exactly.
a storytelling perspective as well.
Exactly. And yes, whether you're making your own stories, whether you're analyzing why certain stories across world literature stuck, like she stuck for some reason.
Why do you think some stories stick and others don't? And have you found common denominators among the stories that have been with us for unbelievably long periods of time like this and those that kind of are ephemeral and disappear?
Absolutely. And I think it's those stories that hit on emotional touch points that remind us that humanity hasn't actually changed. We feel so
Mhm,
modern
mhm,
sometimes
mhm.
that we're living and we have these supercomputers in our pockets and we are doing all of these modern things. However, who we are as humanity, how we connect with other people hasn't changed. How we communicate with other people hasn't changed for thousands of years.
The additional resonance here of that it's Ukraine, which is obviously a topic in the news quite a bit. Is that something, is seeing the very, very tragic conflict in that part of the world, is that something that has been on your mind while you've been working on this project, or has that kind of woven through the process at all?
Right. Yes, absolutely. I'm Ukrainian.
Okay.
I'm first generation American. My mother was not born in the States. My prior book, The Baba Yaga Mask, which is my novel about the Ukrainian grandmother, it's a dual timeline going back and forth between World War II and the present day. That book documents the last time Ukraine was occupied by foreign forces en masse in 1941.
Okay. And that was
It's
by Russia or Germany?
Russia and Germany at the same time
Okay.
during
Okay.
World
Yeah.
War II.
Yeah.
So you have
Yeah.
Russia coming in, or you have Germany coming in from one side, you have Russia coming in from the other side. Ukraine has just wanted to be its own country for a very long time. And that is in the blood of every story I have heard since I was born about the national pride of Ukrainians. I wrote The Baba Yaga Mask, which is fiction documenting the World War II story of Western Ukraine, because that was the story that I didn't think the world knew. And I told it through the story of multiple generations of very strong women. And I told it through the
Hmm.
lens of how folk tales are a part of Ukrainian culture, and folk art and dance and flowers and so many pieces are a part of Ukrainian culture. That book came out 5 weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine
Whoa.
most recently.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So, cut to me, every book that comes out, the author wants it to be timely, but I'm not like that.
Not that timely.
No, and it really was a moment where I had a conversation with my publisher where I'm like, okay, sure, I should be doing publicity. I should be doing jazz hands by my book. And I called them and I'm just said, I need a moment. I can't
Yeah.
wave my hands and say, buy this book right now. A war has broken out. We have family friends who are there. I can't do this. And it was really in kind of rallying together with people in my own Ukrainian community where I found the power of, wait a minute, this is not a stop the presses moment. This is a moment of the world needs to know the history of Ukraine.
Yeah.
The world needs to know Ukrainian identity. And the Baba Yaga book that has now emerged is a continuation of that same mission. Yes.
This is fascinating. This is fascinating. I don't know how much you want to go into into conflict instead of mythology, but my podcast listeners are all going to groan because I've mentioned this book probably more than 25 times on this podcast, but Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, Timothy Snyder.
Mhm.
Yeah. I read that book a couple years ago, and that's the story of Ukraine during in part during that time period. And I have that is the most horrifying book I've read in my entire life. And I wanted to be a horror writer when I was younger. I've never read something that brutal, and I've read a lot of stuff. Um, that tells the story of Ukraine from a war perspective, but I would absolutely love to hear you talk about that period of time from the angle that you've just mentioned, which is women's perspective.
Absolutely, because any war story across history, we always hear the men's perspective of that novel. Um, and for me, and I guess this can twist back and forth into the Baba Yaga conversation, when
Yes.
I was a kid, my grandparents who survived World War II in Ukraine, in this moment where um, Russia is, or Soviets were coming in on one side, and then on the other side, you have Germany, who has already decimated Poland, or excuse me, the Nazis that have just decimated Poland are coming in saying, oh, wait, we'll help you become an independent country and kick out all the Soviets. And you're listening to the Nazi regime say this, and they have everybody over here, and all they want is to be independent. And for about 2 weeks in 1941, Ukraine was an independent country for 2 weeks in
Okay.
1941.
Okay.
And these are the stories I've grown up with. My family never had anything, for better or for worse. My family never had any filters on what they told the children. We heard the stories about my grandfather escaping a prisoner of war camp and walking across the mountains trying to survive for weeks. We heard the stories of war. We heard the stories of burning houses and families dying and people being murdered and witnessed. And we heard these stories. For better, for worse, it shaped me and who I am and the strength that I have found inside of myself as a woman, and of the strength of family, the strength of Ukrainian pride, um, and the strength of how we're all so much stronger than we give ourselves credit for sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And circumstances like that, they change us. And I think they change the DNA of a family, but they change the DNA of a people. And I think Baba Yaga as a character, she forces readers to be faced with horror. And what will you do in that situation? And will you
Oh,
rise up to be your best self? And if you rise up to be your best self, Vasilisa, the beautiful, will be whisked away from her terrible situation, and she will end up marrying the czar. I mean, who doesn't want that story? I mean, maybe not exactly that story, but Baba Yaga has this great side if you can endure her. So what does that say to all of us? That moments sometimes are painful and sometimes we have to endure, but we can get through and magic can happen.
so is Baba Yaga in that sense the creator or the witness or the refuge from horror?
She is the horror,
Okay.
but she's also the catalyst in this situation where she is the one who is that's why she's so fascinating as a character to me, because she's not good, she's not bad,
Hmm.
she's a trickster sometimes, but she allows all of the darkness of the world to be right up front and in your face, and she will purposefully terrify you to see if you can handle it.
Wow.
And this is just the historical record of stories. Really, really fun thing about writing Becoming Baba Yaga as a nonfiction analysis of the history of this one folktale character and the history of Slavic culture and the history of goddesses, and how we can take so much personal transformation out of understanding folktales. The really, really fun part of this is that I got to tell the folktales amid the analysis. So I was one of the earliest conversations with my publishers on this is we were talking about the analysis and how much fun this would be to write this book. But then I got to say, well, what if we, between every single chapter, just told a story, leaned into the darkness of the folktales and retold a classic. So it's kind of my version of the classic, but it's still the classics. And so they go back and forth between classic, sometimes horrifying tales, sometimes intriguing, sometimes playful, sometimes magical, but this all out of kind of the Baba Yaga canon over 300 years or so, if you will. But then talking about how she can teach us so much, no matter how you think about her.
This is incredible. And I'm thinking this seems so and not just because of the conflict in Ukraine, but just because of the state of the world right now where people's
Right,
minds at. This is such a profound and powerful concept. And I think that this is the type of expression of the divine that people tend to be gravitating towards a bit more. I mean, I've talked to people like Dr. Cressida Stone, who wrote a book about Santa Muerte, who's very popular now. Kali is forever perennially popular.
right,
Babylon is someone we
right,
talk about a lot. And th these are all goddesses that confront you with reality as it is, not how you wish it to be. And
right.
that is something that just feels so necessary right now because we don't live in a Disney world. We never did, but
Exactly.
some people in America, some, not all people in America have been able to pretend that everything's fine when of course it never was. But now it's we are confronted with horror every day. And whether it's the conflicts that are going on or the political chaos or the general kind of disintegration and confusion and ideological confusion, um, it's a scary time. So I can see how people would be. I mean, I feel resonant with this concept. I had no idea that Baba Yaga even was a goddess. So this is, I feel resonant with this as you're talking about it. And when you put it in the context of Ukraine, I mean, it's like when you read about what happened in that part of the world during that time and what's happening now, but at that time, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, not just in World War II, but in the famine in the 30s, it
Yes.
staggers belief. It's the type of thing that just cannot even enter the mind of the average Westerner, American.
Absolutely. And another piece that I think the average Westerner doesn't appreciate about that part of the world, and I mean, I'm Ukrainian, so I'm going to say it's a piece of Ukrainian identity,
Hmm.
is how much art and poetry and literature and music and just all of the arts are such a part of the living experience. This is being alive, and the symbolism and just all of the different motifs that are woven in. This is such an essential piece of the whole. So folktales are not a frivolous piece of a culture. Frivolous in terms of, or they can be twisted into morality tales depending on who tells them. They can be twisted into bedtime stories and such. But when you look at folk art embroidery, when you look at the pisenke, the Ukrainian Easter eggs that are designed very meticulously, when you look at the music, the dancing, there are so many metaphors and messages between the lines that tell you the story of a culture and the story and wishes and dreams of people. And Baba Yaga is very much a part of that conversation.
You mentioned previously that war, the novel of war is usually told from the men's perspective. And one of the things that I've been thinking recently is that's probably because war from men's perspective is not nearly as horrific as it is from women's perspective, the
Mm.
perspective of women and children. And most men probably couldn't handle it to see the reality. And so to talk about, I am I'm still curious about like the kind of that time period or now from women's perspective. Definitely. I'm definitely interested in that story and how women saw that and how the figure and please don't filter yourself at all.
Oh, sure.
And how the and how Baba Yaga as a symbol may have, been there or part of that, or rather, as you're talking, it strikes me that periods like that, only the strongest and deepest and most important stories and symbols are going to survive that and come out of that. And for something like this to survive for 7,000 years shows that there's something really deep and resonant and possibly um, a big part of Ukrainian resilience, that type of thing. But I know I just said a lot, but maybe talk about if you can talk about that time period for people who don't know and from women's perspective, please.
Oh, absolutely. So sometimes when we talk about stories of people's beliefs and folk beliefs, people think that it is a far distant time period where people in different cultures believed certain aspects. For my grandmother as a child, she was born in 1920 in Western Ukraine. For my grandmother, as a child, Baba Yaga was real. As a horror, as I wouldn't say necessarily as a goddess, but she was a real figure who lived in the woods, who preyed upon children who weren't good enough and at their best. My grandmother truly believed that if she took a shortcut through the woods, she needed to keep her head down and keep on the path and not waver. And for someone who was perhaps a bit imperfect, my grandmother definitely had a rebellious side. She was terrified of this witch who lived in the woods. By the time Baba Yaga was first introduced to me, I knew her as a character, not someone who I was truly terrified of. But this idea of knowing my grandmother as a young child and like as through a teenager, probably through the time when World War II hit Ukraine, she had this belief of this horror in the woods and how to survive that. Cut to a time in world history where you have the forced famine in the east of Ukraine in the 1930s, where crops are stolen and Ukrainians are starving because of circumstances outside of their control, while world leaders are shown shows of, as the story goes, actors in Ukrainian dress that are rosy cheeked and healthy whenever government officials come by to check on, is this real, this thing going on in Ukraine? And so whenever the reporters come by, acts are put on.
Mhm.
But then thousands upon thousands of people are dying and starving in Eastern Ukraine.
One side
My
note
family
that I
is not on that side of the country. In the
can I throw
West,
in one
there.
side note here? Just for my audience, one of those, and I don't want to disrupt your flow, but one of those reporters, I believe, was Walter Duranty, who was an
You're
associate of
good.
Aleister Crowley, who was goofing off with Aleister Crowley, but then went on to be responsible for it did this for the New York Times and was more or less responsible for the West failing to intervene in Ukraine because he was just parroting Stalin's propaganda. So
Right.
that's a very dark, dark part of New Age history, shall we say. I just wanted to throw that
Absolutely.
in. I'm sorry for interrupting your flow.
Oh, not at all. I mean, the more we take the time to listen to these stories, the more that unfolds that is unimaginable and makes us re-examine our modern day, makes us re-examine our ancestry and our blood and so many things. But yeah, so that was in Eastern Ukraine in the early 1930s. In Western Ukraine, the Galicia region around Lviv was a big cultural center, very close to, I guess, Poland, getting very close to those lines. In fact, the area where my grandfather grew up, when he was born, it was Ukraine. When he was in like nursery school age, didn't go to preschool, but nursery school age, he was in Poland. And that he didn't move cities, same exact city. And then it went back to Ukraine. Like the border was going through this through his entire childhood because territory was being seized. People were being called one thing or another. The Ukrainian language, in some circumstances, was being banned. Again, a long, long story. It's like modern day Ukrainian now is very Russianized just
Mm,
because so much of influence of the Soviet Union for decades upon decades upon decades, Ukrainian now is not the same as Ukraine 100 years ago, Ukrainian 100 years ago, just
mm.
because of forced foreign influences. But anyway, so my family in that area was watching a massive independence movement take place. My family had poets and orchestra players in the symphony and the university. My family was very involved with the arts in that region. And it's just interesting to me how the arts are so much of a form of protest. And maybe that's where the writer in me comes out because there are stories to tell and there are truths to be told.
So, how do you feel about Putin's kind of revanchism, where and his narrative about it being I know all of his history plays into the conflict now, but Putin has, of course, spun a lot of mythology, particularly to our modern day Walter Duranty, Tucker Carlson, about it being a special operation to denazify Ukraine, and they have owned that land back to the 900s under Yaroslav the Wise or whatever it was. How do you? I know this is a bit of a leading question, but how do Ukrainians feel about that?
Maybe I don't want to get too modern day political, but I'll point you
Okay,
to
okay.
the poet known as the father of Ukrainian poetry, Taras Shevchenko, who was a nationalistic poet of the late 1800s who was fighting for Ukrainian independence from survival then, knowing how many centuries the battle had been going when he was writing his poetry. This is not a simple story. Right when my novel, The Baba Yaga Mask, came out in 2022, there was a news report because Russia had just invaded Ukraine at that time, where they were giving the historical context of this moment, and they were saying this goes all the way back to the 1990s. And I looked at this article and I just stood there and I was just, but all the way back to the 1990s. And so I wrote the reporter and I'm just like, please, if we're going to talk about this context, let's get the context right here.
Yeah.
This story goes far back beyond the 90s. And I think, as we know, charismatic world leaders can be very good at spinning stories. And I think the challenge of the modern day is to figure out what's a good story and what is real, and what is being left out, and what is being woven in, perhaps not quite as accurately as it could be. And I think that's a lesson in foreign politics, American politics, and what have you.
One thing that's struck me about the last couple of years of world conflict is how much war now is, yes, on the ground, but also a world war for narrative. And every day on social media, like, what's the story? How are we spinning this? How are how are teenagers spinning the story of a war to their followers on TikTok?
Right.
And that must be, I imagine, fascinating and infuriating as a storyteller, because kind of the idea, the idea of story structures, and I love to talk about that. The idea of story structure, I'm not sure how valid it is now in the social media age, because now we live in a like information blizzard society where it's all atomized, and everyone creates their own story by connecting dots in the blizzard, and everyone's is different.
And every
And
one of those dots is built off of headlines, not actually the stories themselves.
yeah, how do you cope with that as a writer?
It's fascinating to me because I feel like so many people are terrified of artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence is going to change the narrative of the world. And it's like, guys, we're already doing that. I mean, that's a different conversation with its own bugaboos and its own
Mhm.
hopes and its own horrors, just like Baba Yaga. But I feel like the mastery of storytelling, the mastery of a hook, of a lead that will snag somebody's attention, it's always, and now I feel like I'm teaching a writing class, which I also love to do. It's
Please.
always that combination of knowing who is your audience, what do they already know, and what do they care about. Because if you know who your audience is and what they care about, you can spin your story to hook exactly them. And I think that is the social media amazing slash horror show going on right now. And it's true on social media, it's true on news media, it's true in so many facets of life right now, is that people have gotten so good at defining very specific niche audiences and what is the very specific care, dream, worry, fear that that one specific audience has, and then to ram them with this one spin of the story, which then explodes. It's a talent. And for those of us in communications,
Yeah.
it's amazing when you can do that. However, it can be used for good or for evil.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly in the age of social media, where people can be targeted based on their interests, and you can narrowcast to people. And
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier how stories show us that human beings are not that complicated and don't change that much over time, and
Mm-hmm.
that also means that humans have the same, how do I put it, weaknesses to certain narratives and emotional buttons that can be pushed, and that never changes. And people don't
True.
seem to, I mean, people don't really do critical thinking much at all anymore, but people don't seem to get better at resisting that type of thing.
It's true. And that's again, that's where folktales are fascinating because folktales are not long narrative. We're not talking about Homer's Odyssey here. And I say that absolutely loving long epic narrative poetry and other works. But folktales are snippets. They are bedtime stories. They are stories told among friends at dinner time classically. They are short and accessible and entertaining. But at the same time, we have these moments of whether you are reading it or whether you are listening to it, you are living this story alongside with the protagonist. Whether that protagonist is a maiden walking through the woods, whether that protagonist is a prince named Ivan, because really, let's be real, in Slavic folklore, this protagonist is 50% a prince named Ivan. Whether we're talking the Firebird or something else, it's always a prince named Ivan or a maiden named Vasilisa, and that's just like the two top names right there in folklore. It's like Jack and the Beanstalk. There's always a Jack in English folklore.
Okay.
But when you're living those stories that are short, you see the beginning, middle, and end in a very short time frame. You're seeing the journey. You're having those moments when you're experiencing them as a listener or as a reader. What would I do in this situation? What would I do in this situation? And you're forced to confront whether you would be as brave as that protagonist, as weak as that protagonist. Is it actually weakness? Is that actually a good choice, a bad choice? And this is why storytelling makes us stronger people, because we suddenly have to empathize with people in different shoes and different circumstances, examine ourselves and the people around us in a completely new light. And folktales are just short, sweet snippets of that.
Do you feel that folktales are also, particularly because they've survived so long, do you think that they will, I mean, on one hand, do you feel that they are portals back to what is most true and most real and most lasting, but also do you think that they will survive the social media age?
Absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
think right now in film, in literature, think about how many retellings are happening right now. Think about
Okay.
retellings of Beauty and the Beast. Think about Snow White, Cinderella, like all your classic grim fairy tales. People are obsessed with them, and it's not purely a nostalgia factor.
Hmm.
People are obsessed with them because sometimes old stories speak eternal truths.
Hmm.
And sometimes migratory patterns or, I don't know, email threads might change the narrative of them a little bit. But it was migratory patterns that took old story goddesses and twisted them into witches.
Hmm.
It was,
Say,
I don't
say more
know.
about that. What you just said. It was migratory patterns that took old stories and twisted them into witches. What did you mean by that?
So you have all of these classic stories, whether we're talking about Maddie Zemnya, which is kind of a old goddess, I think about 2,000 years old, who was the one who you would speak to her and she would proclaim her judgments by whispering her secrets into the holes in the earth. You had Mokesh, who was the one that the statue that the grandson of Princess Olga of Kiev with the pigeons and the fire and burning of the village down. You have the statues that went up and down. You had Christianity that was coming in at the same time. There are a lot of forces. And as more people leave their small villages and find the world outside of them, what do they hear? They hear more stories. And you know what? Sometimes it's a massive game of telephone that you remember this really good story and then you tell to somebody else and they love this story and they tell to somebody else. And by the time you get to that fifth person, it's a drastically different story. But then take that onto a migratory route where you have someone in ancient Greece trading with somebody in Egypt who is trading with somebody around the Slavic lands. And don't get me started on stories about the Amazons and how they are true. That's a whole different
Oh,
conversation.
please, yeah, please do. Stories about Amazons and how they're true. What do you mean?
um, so to finish the one thought, I'll go back.
Yes, yes, yes.
Um, but giant games of telephones, when you start crossing cultural lines, things twist and expand in different ways. And it's fascinating to see how similar stories exist in nearby and very far off places, and tracing like world histories of explorers and how those stories sometimes can find their similar route. What were they? They weren't archaeologists. Um, there were anthropologists from, I believe, Ireland just recently did this with the Beauty and the Beast narrative and traced it back thousands upon thousands of world and figuring
Hmm,
out where
hmm,
was the root
hmm.
story that this came from.
Where was
And
it?
they
I'm
just did this
curious.
fascinating study. Um, oh, but so going back to how Homer's The Odyssey is also a fascinating piece of world literature, and what can we learn from that? There's thousands of things we could have on that conversation, but he speaks of the Amazons. Well, there are burial mounds that have been dug up in the past 20 years, even amid the war happening in Ukraine right now, of female warriors whose skeletons are bow-legged, which points to they were on horseback. They were buried with bows and arrows, and expensive like jewelry and not offerings, jewelry and just things that kind of showed that there was a certain level of status in a female-based warrior society, and their burial mounds.
Hmm.
And this has been in the New York Times in the past 10 years. And it's like, well, put this together with the telephone game of migration patterns of, okay, there were these women who were very strong warriors on horseback. The story is told, the story is told, the story is told, and all of a sudden you have these like immortal women of how we know the Amazons according to the Greeks. There's some truth to the story, the kernel of the story. So
Hmm.
again,
Wow.
yeah, I have a whole section on the Amazons in here too, because the Amazons could travel. You know what else Baba Yaga can do? Baba Yaga can travel. She lives in a house that stands on chicken feet so that no one can find her. If someone is approaching her, her house can stand up and turn around so they can't find the front door. In some versions, her house just spins and spins and spins. And in some versions, her house stands and runs to a darker part of the forest so she
Mhm.
can never be found. But if you look at ancient migratory um, farming societies where they actually moved from one location, and then when that soil was done, they moved to a different location. There's a long history of nomadic cultures in Slavic worlds that, again, like, does that play into the Baba Yaga moving house story? Does it? Does it not? Does this whole history of women who are very strong but mobile, does that play into the Baba Yaga story? So again,
Ah,
sometimes
interesting. Interesting.
we don't always know the answers, but chasing the possibilities is a hero's quest all of its
Yeah.
own.
I love that you mentioned Heroes Quest because that goes into one of my next questions. But I just real quick, did they find the original source of the Beauty and the Beast story?
Oh, they did, and I'm so not prepared with that answer. Yes, there was a study, I think it was out of, oh gosh, I want to say University of Limerick, but I'm probably making that up. I can shoot it to you for your audience
Sure.
after the
Yeah, no,
fact,
I'm super curious. So
because
yeah,
yes,
you
there was some fascinating stuff on that.
you mentioned the hero's journey. I was going to ask you about that because that's something I've been thinking recently. It is boring. Like the monomyth, the Joseph Campbell, like we've been subjected to it every day of our lives for particularly since Star Wars came out. And it's just, like I was in Hollywood for 11 years and everyone uses that as the template for everything. And it's tedious and it's not that it's not great. It's just, if you eat carrots for dinner every night, carrots are gonna
It's
not
been
be great.
done.
Yeah, so and one thing that I've been thinking about more recently is other story structures, and particularly more female story structures like The Descent of Inanna. But when you talk about Baba Yaga and these stories that are not just female stories, but stories about the dark feminine or the dark goddess, what your thoughts on that are there other, what is the story structure of that as opposed to the male hero's journey?
Absolutely. I love this question so much. So often when we're talking about, oh goodness, the divine feminine, for example, sometimes we'll be talking about the triple goddesses. Sometimes we'll speak of the concept of maiden, mother, crone. With Baba Yaga, I like to always morph the word maiden because maybe it's just an antiquated word and I'm not in love with it, because maiden, uh, there's a degree of it I always twist it for Baba Yaga stories in this conversation and call it, I actually have a chapter in Becoming Baba Yaga that's titled Feminist Mother Crone,
Mhm.
because there's something to be said for youth and bravery and perhaps a degree of naivete about certain aspects of the world, but how that lends itself to such an unstoppable nature. Um, and in the Baba Yaga stories, the protagonists are almost, well, if we're looking at female protagonists, which her stories have both, the boys are almost always a prince named Ivan. The girls are frequently named Vasilisa. But when you have the protagonists who are female, who are some reason going to see Baba Yaga or be trapped by Baba Yaga, something like that, it's interesting because depending on their age is a very clear guideline of what happens in the story.
Hmm.
If they are incredibly, incredibly young, there is a story where two siblings are off in the woods. It's very much a Hansel and Gretel story of Olga and, oh, I'm not going to remember his name. Anyway, there's a very Hansel and Gretel-ish type story that's a very much a morality tale. Be good little children or Baba Yaga will get you. But as you get older and older, you have these stories of women and young women stepping up and facing horrors, which will be in adulthood. This is what you're going to have to face
Hmm.
to survive. And yes, sometimes in classic historical fashion, it's to survive to be a good wife and find a happy marriage. And like there are pieces of that or that are just built into the stories just because this is historically what we're talking about in the world that so much of this was living in, that you have to be able to clean your house and cook a good meal, and then all of your dreams will come true. There's aspects of that in some of the stories, but there's also a matter of endurance and protecting your own
Hmm.
and being able to stand up for yourself. And that's not your typical morality tale narrative. There's a, you've got to stick up for yourself and be brave and clever, because if you aren't clever, if you aren't smart about this really terrible situation you're in, you're going to die.
Hmm.
But if you are smart about it, and if you're thoughtful, and at the same time, you kind of need to be respectful to that horror. You need to give respect to that horrible, horrible thing you're facing. And of course, the horrible thing in this case is Baba Yaga. You've got to be polite to her because you got to remain respectful, but through your respect, be brave and clever, and you're going to survive the situation. And I think that's the narrative that comes up over and over again with the Baba Yaga tales for women specifically.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. Interesting.
and
Yeah, I mean, there's something that, strikes me about women's communication that's different from men a bit, which is how do I how do I put it? Kind of like a constant diffuse awareness of and sharing of danger and danger
yeah,
signals, which
yeah.
is what I think of when you're talking about Baba Yaga or other stories in this way.
Exactly. I think it wasn't recently. I think it was closer to 2014 when Crimea was first invaded. It was on social media. It was like all of these things. There was a music video of these Ukrainian grandmothers, and I think it was called the Baba Army because Baba translate is grandmother. It doesn't translate to witch, it translates to grandmother. And just like the word granny can go in different directions. You could say Baba like loving grandmother, but you could also say Baba like old granny in a negative connotation. Granny can be loving and granny can be negative. So sometimes people think Baba means like terrible old crone. No, it just means grandmother, and you can twist that however you want it. But anyway, around 2014, around the time when Crimea was invaded, there was this video that was going everywhere on social media of these women, these Ukrainian grandmothers who were all like cleaning or like feeding the chickens or doing these like classic country rural life tasks that an old woman would have. And then all of a sudden they look up and there's something on the horizon. It's very vague in the video. And all of a sudden these women, like their eyes narrow, they put on their soldiers' uniforms, and then they like put a gun, rifle, or something on their back. And then they're just singing at the top of their lungs
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
Ukrainian
Hmm.
about how the grandmothers are going to protect this country.
Hmm.
And boys, don't you worry, we've gotcha. And that's just such a spirit of Ukrainian women, of everything I have ever known, is
Wow.
there are horrors, but you know what? We can get through it. We stick together. We find our ways. You can't doubt a Ukrainian woman, and you can't doubt Baba Yaga.
Well, it seems, yeah, and it seems to me that that spirit very much has to come from a sense of identity, and a sense of identity has to come from well, certainly can come from folklore, but comes from having a shared identity, and that's something that I don't know if Americans really have anymore.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like, I don't know. This,
Yeah, it's funny because my mom arrived in the States when she was 6 years old. So she grew up largely in the States. And of course, any immigrant experience would be a familiar version of the tale of trying to figure out how to assimilate and understand new cultures and everything that goes, language barriers, everything that goes into that.
Mhm.
But by the time I came into the world, um, I remember, and I always translate this is my mom's Ukrainian female strength twisted in an American mom way. I was probably, I don't know, like 3, 4. This is like one of my first memories that my mom had a record player. And she had the Helen Reddy album, I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar. And
Oh
I don't
yeah.
know where the rest of my family was in this situation. I mean, there are other people in my house, but I don't know who was around in this moment. But I just remember my mom putting on this record and blasting at the top of the lungs and telling me to go up to the top of a stairway and to sing at the top of my lungs. And I'm like 3 or 4 or something. I am woman, hear me roar. And I probably could sing the whole thing when I was 4 years old. And she's like, was telling me, she's like, stomp and sing. Like, okay, so of course, like what 4-year-old doesn't want to stomp and sing? So you go up to the top of the stairs, like sing. She has the radio or the record player blasting. I am singing this at the top of my lungs. And I remember her clapping really hard and things saying, okay, that was awesome. Or she didn't say awesome, but she was like, that was wonderful. Again, she's go back to the top of the stairs and do it louder. And I remember she
Mm,
made
mm,
me do
mm.
it multiple times. I am woman, hear me roar, this whole big thing. There's a line in there that I think is like something my brother won't understand, which in my own like young child brain was like my actual brother, not like brotherhood, not humanity.
Mhm,
But I
mhm.
just remember that moment. And I always reflect back on that moment of my mom, who was not born American, but became American over time and has a very strong Ukrainian and American identity now. Gosh, my mom's amazing. Has been teaching Ukrainians who have come over in the past couple of years English to figure out how they can get by in the States.
Mm,
I mean,
mm,
she's
mm.
still doing great work. But that whole idea of strong women being a part of who Ukrainian women are, I just always makes me laugh that she took that and translated into American culture. And that was a part of my childhood too.
That's such a beautiful story and such an amazing parenting story also.
Mhm.
And it's as you're saying that, I can't help but think of, and this is a conversation that's been coming up on the podcast more and more, but um just the general sense of women being under attack and trying to be silenced, particularly in America, from both sides of the political spectrum, also
Right,
throughout the world, from rising theocracy in the Middle East, for instance,
right.
at a very, very extreme level with Islamism, and just how much it's almost like it's not just that women's rights are being rolled back, it's that they're being gaslit into silence, and
Right.
and that is in a way the opposite of the story you just told, and that's something that is very, very concerning, and I'm wondering if not just young women but people are getting that message. uh
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's one of those things when I was working on my novel, The Baba Yaga Mask, that was actually a piece that I really wanted to be in there, is because sometimes when people think about this idea of a strong woman, that means one thing to a lot of people. Like it means like she's very bold and she's very brash and all of this stuff. And you know what? That's one way to be a strong woman. But the idea of what a strong woman is means 100 different things. You
okay.
can be strong and silent. You can be strong as a mother. You can be strong as someone who has no children. You can be strong when you are 15 years old. You can be strong when you are a great great grandparent and you are still there kicking. There are so many different personality types and aspects of strength that are not explored with women. It's pretty much like you can talk about beauty or you can talk about intelligence or you can talk about strength. And these are all very singularly defined pieces when it comes to women. And the Baba Yaga Mask, as I said, jumps back and forth as a novel between 1941 Western Ukraine and present day Eastern Europe. And I say present day directly before
Okay.
2022. So
Okay.
present day
Okay.
before the Russian invasion. It was written before that happened, published right as it happened. But it actually has the voices of 3 different women who were following in that story. It's the grandmother in the present day, but also that same grandmother when she was a teenager. And so you see this one character as she was 15 years old and as she is 90 years old. But then also her granddaughters, because as I said, the story of that is this woman who said before she dies, she wants to see Ukrainian soil again. She flies to Eastern Europe, steps off a plane, and completely disappears. And it's the story of the two grandmothers going on a wild goose chase across Eastern Europe, trying to uncover what happened to their grandmother. Is she sick? She's 90 years old. Like, is she sick? Did something happen? Or is she up to something? Because knowing their grandmother and the small snippets of her World War II history and life story that they know, she's always up to something. And so through this wild goose chase across multiple countries in Europe, they discover their own Ukrainian family history through that wild goose chase. But these three women are incredibly different. The grandmother, who was the one who was a teenager in World War II Ukraine, like she is bold and she is brash and she is a rebel. And one of the granddaughters is a young mom, and she is trying to cross every T and dot every I and do everything perfectly by the book, according to Pinterest. She is trying to like do everything perfectly. And that is
Yeah.
a very real expectation on young
Yeah.
moms these
Yeah.
days, that you have
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
perfect and give your kids the 500 things, because everybody's giving their kids the
Well,
500
it's
things.
often it's often now you have to be a perfect mom and have a career or be a boss,
Yes.
at the same
Yes,
time, which would drive anyone crazy. It's just not possible,
exactly.
so
So you
that's a
have the
lot.
grandmother, you have the young mother, and then you have the two sisters. The young mother has a sister who is single and childish and in some ways a free spirit, but she has kind of this gut intuition where she just notices things about the world, that her sister and her are polar opposites in so many ways. And sometimes they clash, but they both are amazingly brilliant and strong in completely diverse ways. And I wanted to put that on the page because women need to see it, men need to see it, the world needs to see it.
Do you feel that this is something that is less apparent or that is vanishing from the world?
In what respect?
Well, you're saying that people need to see it, and it seems to me that people are feeling more disempowered than ever on a lot of levels. And one of the reasons is I don't think they have a clear sense of identity. They don't have a connection with anything larger than themselves. Maybe, I don't know. But that seems
Absolutely.
to be something that, if folklore, if anything, should put us in touch with the deepest truths of who we are.
Absolutely. And I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about right now we're living in a moment in world history where people are really good at finding the hook or the lead that will be very interested to this one specific tiny, tiny group. And then that one tiny, tiny group just becomes a bubble with this one narrative. And I think in the history of what is a woman in American society today, what is a woman in the world today,
Hmm.
we have a lot of bubbles. And we have a lot of
Okay.
people who are just seeing their singular definition. And there are many ways that women can be strong. And I think world history, the history of goddesses, the history of folklore can show us the path of understanding others' transformations and our own.
Interesting. Yeah. Um, for somebody who wants to tap into that, do you think it's important for somebody to look into the folklore of their own ancestry, or are you kind of the Jungian idea that these are transcendent ideas that are there no matter what culture you're in?
Let me answer both. I
Yes,
think
please.
there's an amazing power in tapping deep into whatever roots of your own you can find. I mean, it's hard sometimes to trace ancestry and to figure out where your people came from, and whatever you can figure out, that's not easy for all people. And I get that. If you can figure out something that is loosely tied to who maybe within your blood, research, look for those stories, because there's depth that is empowering if you dare to discover it. That's where my third book came from, actually, because I was doing so much exploration on Ukrainian history and where do the classic family stories merge with actual world history? Because you never know sometimes the
Hmm, hmm.
stories told around the table at Thanksgiving, how much of a tall tale is that story versus how much actually happened in this moment when my grandfather was 22 years old? Like, what was actually happening in the world in that moment when this story happens? Like, does this actually mesh?
Okay.
So it's fascinating to like go through that exploration. My third book is called the Family Story Workbook. And I wrote that book, and it's legitimately a workbook full of questions for interviewing,
Wow.
for passing
Wow,
around
that's
the
really
things.
interesting. That's really
Yeah.
wow. How
It's great. And
incredible.
it's
How
for,
incredible.
it came out during the height of COVID, where people were communicating over Zoom and they were having conversations with their grandparents via Zoom.
What an incredible gift to people. That's amazing.
And I have been so honored at the stories that people have told me about that book, about taking it to holiday dinners and passing it around the table and having everybody answer the same question, because you know what, you and your siblings might have a completely different version of that story that happened to you all in 1989, you know? And then asking like a different generation about that same story, or asking a different generation about a secret that they never told their parents,
Hmm.
or asking a different generation. And you just through this, I mean, really, it is a collection of questions, and there are lines to write in that book. So you can capture your family stories and hold them for yourselves or pass it on for whatever the historical record means to you. That book arose because I was doing this so deeply with myself and just felt such profound personal, I don't know, rekindling of my own identity by doing that process. But then on the other side of things, you don't have to go into all of that stuff. I encourage you, but you don't have to. I love world storytelling because, yes, right now I am in the midst of a Slavic exploration going into Ukrainian roots and Amazons and Baba Yaga folktales and all of this. And that's very much who I am. But at the same time, my next project is on the depths of Lewis Carroll and Alice in
Oh wow.
Wonderland.
Okay.
And I feel like
Okay.
there is so much discussion there. There is so much to be said about, I don't know, name a place in the world, and then go explore their stories. The more diversely you read and listen, the more rounded and better of a person you will be. I have absolute faith in that.
Yeah, and we definitely live in a time where, there's YouTube and there's all these internet resources where you can visit parts of the world without visiting them
Exactly.
not perfectly obviously, but in a sense,
Yes,
we have the ability with the internet to explore whatever it is that interests us at any given moment, which is an amazing thing. And I think probably is what bringing the world closer together.
absolutely.
I'm curious, Bob does the Baba Yaga figure, because I've always heard this as being a Russian folklore figure. Does this go to Russia also, or is it Ukraine also only, and is it different between them?
So I love this question because I think especially when you have stories, published stories from the past couple hundred years, she's always in collections of Russian folk
Yeah,
tales.
yeah.
And she's a Russian folktale, but she's also a Ukrainian folktale. She's also, yeah, in Belarus, and she's also,
Mhm.
I mean, name a lot of areas of Eastern Europe, and she is a native folklore. Will she be the exact same person in every single one of these? No, but I mean, the story that you heard were told at bedtime is probably a little bit different from some your neighbor was told at bedtime. I mean, just the nature of distance changes things just a little bit. No one, she doesn't have ownership in any one of these countries, but I will loudly protest the second anyone starts calling her a Russian folktale
Okay,
figure.
okay,
She is
okay.
that,
So yeah,
but
please
she's,
please clear that up. Please
yeah,
clear that up.
yeah, and if you think about it also, people often say the Russian folktale record because think about the history of publishing. In the history of publishing, people went to different countries to get translations of different world stories, and they went to big cities where people had connections. So you had a connection between London publishing houses and Moscow publishing houses and all of this stuff. And there was not necessarily the empire of publishing in Kiev
Okay.
that there may have been in other locations. So when it came to just English translations of these folklores, it was easiest to get from Russia. The first exposure might have been Russia. So hence they became Russian folktales, but Russia is
Oh,
just
okay.
one
Okay.
location where
Okay,
they
that's
came
good.
from. That was just
That's really good to clear up then. Are there differences in the story and the figure of Baba Yaga depending on parts of that region you get the
uh,
story in?
absolutely. I mean, there are 100 different derivations of it. Sometimes her name is sometimes a little bit different from Baba Yaga to Baba Yaga to adding in various different letters. In the tradition I grew up with, she is called Baba Yaga. I once had someone tell me I was pronouncing her name wrong, and it was just very funny because like my family is Ukrainian. Like this is English was not their first language, and these were their stories. So I don't think they're wrong. Again, Russia versus Ukraine, like just different languages call her different things. Um, of the derivations, I'm just trying to think the easiest thing to do. Okay, so think about, I said that she has a hut that stands on chicken legs, which is just a great visual, really.
Yeah.
I mean, every illustrator probably loved illustrating the hut in the middle of the woods on chicken legs. That's just great. Sometimes the hut has one leg, sometimes the hut has two. I've seen versions where, going back to your goat devil story, there's versions of the hut where it's actually on four goat legs, like
Ah,
prancing around
okay.
the woods.
Even
Um,
scarier.
yes, sometimes her hut's just in the middle of the woods. Often she has a gate made of bones that surrounds her hut, and there's a lock made out of a human skull to open the gates. But again, this exists in some, this doesn't exist in some. And then this is one of those life and death questions that is this the remnants of a goddess hiding in the tales, where some of the goddesses that it is supposed that she was built out of were the goddesses of life and death, these people who were a partner as you entered the world when you're born and the partner as you left the mortal world as we know it when you died. So yes, you could say the bones and the fence around her house are this terrifying American Halloween horror show. Or you could say, you know what, these are bones of the dead who are revered, and she's holding on to their memories.
Hmm,
So again, you could look
interesting.
at where these little symbols come from, and then you can trace back little breadcrumbs, because we're talking about folk tales, and find things that line up that say, wait, that's not as simple as I thought it was.
Interesting. Yeah, I like I imagine no pun intended by saying breadcrumbs because of folk tales. That's pretty funny.
Right. Can't help myself sometimes.
Um, yeah, very, very interesting. I blanked again. Um, oh, I remember what I was going to ask you. Has your view of Baba Yaga changed? How has it changed in working on these projects? And has have you had any interesting experiences along the way where, you know,
Hmm.
kind of revelations or life experiences that shaped those projects or changing views?
I have learned so much more about her than I originally knew. Like I knew of her as a figure that people believed in as real and a figure that some believed in just as a character. And I knew about that dichotomy. And I knew about the dichotomy of faith, where as a child, my grandparents were deeply religious, very much churchgoers. But at the same time, I was told never to be disrespectful to this one lady who lived down the street because she was a witch and would give you the evil eye and all of this stuff. So I knew of this dichotomy of belief. And I knew of Baba Yaga falling somewhere in the midst of this, but in a different place. But she was wrapped in stories. And it was something that's always intrigued me. The depth of the history, I think, was profound to stumble down and to figure out kind of where this one known goddess links actually with this one goddess and which links with this one goddess. And you can connect them again. It's like the game of telephone that they kind of borrow traits from the next one in line and they borrow traits down the historical
Mm.
record. And you can kind of see this pattern of what they symbolize and what they represent and character traits and physical traits that kind of carry on through the generations through different belief systems until you get to, not until, who knows what will come next, but until you have Baba Yaga in her present versions, that's just this amalgamation of all of these past figures. That was fascinating to me. It was also fascinating to me going into all of these stories. In some of them, Baba Yaga has a flock of black geese that do her bidding. And others that there's this like immortal battle between Baba Yaga and a hedgehog and Baba Yaga, just like neither of them will give any ground.
What does the
And it just is
hedgehog
very funny
represent?
because I'm terrified of geese. I don't know. I had smell weakness.
Oh
I
yeah,
am
geese are
absolutely,
scary. Geese are the teeth. They're like little dinosaurs. They're terrifying.
they're terrifying.
I got
And it
chased
was
by
just
a
one of
goose
those,
once when I was a kid.
yeah, oh gosh.
Yeah,
Oh
they're
my gosh.
scary. They are scary.
Super scary. And it's just one of those things finding, I'm like, oh my gosh, maybe these folk tales are simmering in my blood. And that's why I've always been terrified of geese because they are owned by Baba Yaga. And clearly that's why I've always been terrified of them. And I've
Oh,
always had an affinity for hedgehogs because I just think they're adorable. But then there are all these hedgehogs standing up to battle Baba Yaga stories. I'm like, well, clearly I have a love of hedgehogs because they're a major character in a number of Baba Yaga stories where they're just fearless and brave. And how cool is that?
very cool. I know there is a lot of there's been a lot of work on kind of reconstructing Slavic paganism, particularly, and from what I understand, it's a big deal in Ukraine. Have you heard anything about people actually working with Baba Yaga as a goddess in kind of like a
Absolutely.
neo-pagan context, and what's going on with that?
Absolutely. And I think it goes back to that earlier concept we were talking about, is she is such a mix of horror and hope. She's such a mix of magic and the mundane that she's not complicated. She's very simple. It goes back to the concept of the mortar that she exists in through so much is this place of transformation. And if you're willing to confront the horrors of the world, the scary pieces of yourself, your own shadow, if you will, and acknowledge it respectfully, as you would acknowledge Baba Yaga respectfully, thoughtfully, and how you can actually use Baba Yaga and an understanding and belief and study of her to empower your own possibilities. Yes, definitely. So
Okay, okay.
she's very powerful in those ways. I don't practice in those ways, but I know many people who do.
What
And
type of people do you meet who are approaching the story in that way, shall we say?
um, I mean, what type of people?
Is
Just,
that
I mean,
people here
people
or
who
Ukraine or
everywhere,
everywhere?
honestly.
Okay, okay,
Ukrainians, yes,
okay,
a lot of Americans.
okay.
I think I've Canadians. I've met
Wow.
people from around the world who are there's so many people in the world today who are looking to understand the connectivity of humanity with something bigger.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are lost on that journey and exploring where in history have people found a deeper connection than they feel right now. And I think Baba Yaga slides into that slot beautifully and can be understood as a character. And I know many people do see her as a goddess to meditate on,
Hmm.
to speak to. And again, it's about personal transformation and confronting the horrors of the world and oneself
Well,
for the betterment of all.
this is just such a profound gift. It's such a profound concept. Maybe that's a good place to end on. But for me, a lot has come out of this conversation. But just this image of a goddess, a dark goddess that represents inevitable horror as, I suppose, a maturing force and as
Mhm.
a call to dealing with reality as it is and not how we would wish it to be is it, at least what I'm taking from what you're saying. Please add to
Right.
that. But what a profound concept and what a timely image for 2024 and beyond.
It's true. It is very true. I have been so honored to spend so much time on this project, to connect with early readers on this project. I mean, to work with, I spend a lot of time with book clubs and small groups. And I mean, whether library groups or just personal community groups, friend groups, whatever it is, call me. Um, but working with people and just seeing when my novel came out that had so much of the Baba Yaga folklore intertwined within it, how many people didn't know? How many people had no idea about Slavic literature, not
Mm.
Slavic literature like Tolstoy, but Slavic folk
Right,
tales?
right, right.
Tolstoy is another conversation I would love to have, but
Right.
we only have so much
Another
time.
another person forcing people to confront the horrors of reality, and
Right.
Madame Bovary. Um, where can people find out more about you, your work? I guess your it sounds like you do workshops, and where can they get your books?
Right. So everything about me can be found on my website. It's krisspisak.com. It's Kris with a K, K-R-I-S, Spisak, Spisak.com. If you Google the Baba Yaga mask, you will find me. If you Google becoming Baba Yaga, you will find me. I'm on Instagram all over the place. I love exploring little known world stories. I love exploring little known word origin stories. This is my favorite thing to discuss. So that's kind of, I'm all over the place on Instagram in that realm. Obviously, Baba Yaga is a part of those conversations. I have newsletters. My books are available wherever books are sold. Again, look up my name. All five of my books are for sale everywhere. Becoming Baba Yaga and the Baba Yaga Mask, both the fiction and the nonfiction, they're standalone completely. They don't necessarily go together, but if you want a further depth, they definitely play off of each other. They're both available both in paperback and audiobook.
Awesome. Well, this is a great conversation. Thank you very, very much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.